We are now going to transition into another, what I consider very exciting discussion by this committee. And we are going to transition now to a discussion of a kind of an intriguing title, I think, which is Robots, Education, and Workforce, Transformers and Transformation. And the only title we left out is the word artificial intelligence, because we know artificial intelligence is going to be a dominant consideration for us in the next several decades. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And I think in all 50 states we share both the promise of artificial intelligence, the promise of autonomous vehicles, the promise of more robots helping us reduce some of the mundane tasks we have, the promise of computers and robots helping improve surgery and off-site diagnosis, but we also have anxiety in our communities about the rate of transition that will be associated in the changing workforce of the future. And I think as governors, we are sensitive to both the hope of that artificial intelligence and the recognition that as we go through this transition, we are going to, by necessity, have to do several things to make sure that this transformation supplements and improves our people's lives, as well as the concomitant economic growth associated with it. At the same time, A, getting our people ready for it in skills development, and second, cushioning the transition associated with the transformation that will take place. And I am looking forward to this discussion about both the anticipated pace of that change and what we as governors could be most effective at is getting our people ready. And I know that various governors have done great things of innovation to help in this regard, and I'm looking forward to hearing about them. One of the things we have emphasized in my state, we think we've made, and I don't think we're the only state in this regard, to some degree, a bit of a mistake by sending a message to our kids that if you don't get a 4-year degree, you're a failure. And that message has degraded our ability to prepare our kids for all of these technical jobs that are going to grow dramatically in the future that may not require a 4-year degree. So we have started a robust career-connected learning initiative in our state. It's going very, very rapidly. We've had our first 18 consecutive quarters of growth in our registered apprenticeship program. And when I say registered apprenticeship, this isn't just in the trades. I know that alludes to, we think of trades and apprenticeship. We're apprenticeships in computer programming. So we have the first computer programming apprenticeship program in the country. It's called Apprenti. I got to go to the second graduation of about 60 people. And these are mostly middle-aged people who've transitioned into computer programming from another career. So we're excited about that, but we're also excited on the side of helping families through this transition process. And in any disruptive economic change, there's transition and there's things that are upset, patterns of living, careers. And I certainly believe that we have a role helping smooth that transition. So we have this year one of the best family leave and paid family leave policies in the nation that will help, I believe, as people go back to school, to reorient their education and give them an opportunity to have that second, third, and fourth careers. I believe that will be part of the things we'll need to do to help in this transition. We have requested the Boston Consulting Group to do an analysis of what this transition will look like. And I'm going to commend that to you, and we're going to have further discussion about that. But before that, Governor Dugard, could you take it away?
Thank you, Governor. Work is an important part of personal fulfillment. Of course, most people work because they need to provide for themselves and their families, but ideally, and at its essence, work is also rooted to self-fulfillment. And when you've got a job that pays enough and is enjoyable, that's really the ideal. Unfortunately, many young people are struggling, we know, to find enjoyable, well-paying work. Some lack a degree or professional training, and sometimes they went straight into the workforce after high school or started a program after high school and then didn't finish that program. But even with those who have degrees, they often have trouble finding meaningful work. For instance, those who have a 4-year degree, only 36% say their education prepared them for a job. And more than half of recent graduates are either unemployed or underemployed. Now, it's not for lack of jobs. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us just recently, now we have more job openings than job seekers in America. And a number of these jobs are higher paying, higher skilled jobs in areas like healthcare, cybersecurity, manufacturing. But unfortunately, those looking for work don't have the skill sets that employers are seeking. The Western Governors Association spent the last year studying the skills gap, and we found that integrating state efforts, increasing the availability of training, expanding broadband access in rural areas, and connecting education to careers are ways to help address that workforce gap. We need to ensure that a degree is not just a destination, but a pathway to a job. And that means providing students with better information earlier and guidance so they can explore careers and make enlightened choices about the pathways they'll follow to their preferred future. One way we're doing this in South Dakota is through a pilot program called Career Launch. This program involves a number of pilot school districts which are pooling resources to provide more career counseling and to give students more hands-on experience. For example, one of our school districts, Yankton, many high school seniors are planning their schedules so their traditional classes are compressed into half a day, either all in the morning or all in the afternoon. And during the other half of the day, the students are working at a paid internship with a local employer. Each student receives high school credit, is paid at least $11 an hour, and in South Dakota, that's a good wage, gains exposure to a career field, and learns foundational skills like showing up on time, how to arrive on time, dress appropriately, interact with customers and peers. And that gives them a chance to taste test a career field or two while they're still in high school. Workforce is a complex issue, and I know we're going to be talking more about it. There's no one single solution or legislative bill that's going to be a fix. It takes an integrated approach, clearly, from all sectors. So I'm looking forward to learning from our speakers today. First today, we're going to have Rich Davey, who's an associate director at Boston Consulting Group here. He's going to walk us through data they have compiled on the future of work in regions across the country. So governors, that resource is available at your seats, or it will be if it isn't already. And I'm going to now turn it over to Rich to provide a brief overview of that resource. Please welcome Rich Davey. Rich?
Thank you, Governor. And given the time, I will be brief, Governor. But again, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm Rich Davey, an Associate Director at the Bethesda, Maryland office of Boston Consulting, Governor, and also the sector leader for our state and local practice here in North America. As a former Cabinet Secretary, I'm really appreciated and delighted to be with you today to talk a little bit about this work we did. BCG has worked on workforce development, the topic globally. We've partnered with the World Economic Forum to produce several reports that consider the future of work, as you mentioned, Governor, and some of those reports are actually referenced in the materials you have in front of you today. We've also done some thinking about the growing skills gap here in the United States and specifically provided a snapshot of those anticipated skills gaps by region in your materials as well. And finally, earlier this year, we were actually honored to work directly with Governor Baker and his team in Massachusetts to think really deeply about addressing the state's skills gap for middle wage jobs, jobs that you all know are really critical to the middle class in each of your states. We helped the governor consider strategies to close that gap over the next several years, and we've included in your materials details about that work, and I'd be happy to talk to you or your teams after this session about how that work could be applied in your states as you all work hard to ensure good jobs are available for all Americans. So again, Governor, thank you for having us today and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Rich. We're also privileged now today to be joined by Dr. Alan Kruger. He's the Bendheim Professor of Economics and Public Affairs. And he's published widely on the economics of education, unemployment, labor demand, income distribution, social insurance, labor market regulation, even terrorism and environmental economics. Since 1987, he's held a joint appointment in the economics department and at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. He is the founding director of the Princeton University Survey Research Center. In addition, he previously served as chairman of President Barack Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, assistant secretary for economic policy, and chief economist of the U.S. Department of the Treasury, chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor, and he was vice president of the American Economic Association just last year. Please welcome Dr. Kruger.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you invited me rather than a robot to give my presentation today. We're meeting at a time when the unemployment rate is down to 4%. Economic growth for the second quarter looks like it could be around 4%. Yet there are many reasons to be concerned about the state of the job market. Wage growth remains too low. Wage growth is barely keeping up with inflation. Labor force participation is too low. The U.S. has the second lowest labor force participation rate in the OECD, second only to Italy. And third, and most important, the economy is not generating enough opportunities for middle-class workers and from workers from more disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, these problems have been with us for a long time, and the strong economy helps, but it is clearly not sufficient. And when the economy turns down again, which it surely will, these problems will be even worse. Now, it's very difficult to predict the future path of the economy, but it seems to me most likely that the future will not look very different from the present, in that we currently have a dynamic economy. Various sectors are perpetually disrupted, and we are faced with having to help workers make a transition to a new economy. I think robotics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, many other new innovations to come are not going to fundamentally change that picture. Now, I think economists should also have a great deal of humility when it comes to thinking about the future of the economy, and particularly the labor market. The great economist John Maynard Keynes in 1930 predicted that we will have a future of technological unemployment. He said back then, this is a term you might not have heard of, but you should get used to technological unemployment. Now, since then, we've created hundreds of millions of jobs worldwide. In the US, total employment has grown by more than 5-fold since Keynes made that prediction. But we need to worry about the quality of jobs. So my concern is not about a jobless future. My concern is about the types of jobs that will be created, whether they will pay enough for people to raise families in dignity and to feel that they're part of the American dream. I think it's critical that we prepare our workforce for the transition that has already started. And we also have to prepare our infrastructure for that transition. And I think we need to modernize our social contract for that transition and for the jobs that are emerging in the future. And we really face two problems. One problem is the one that gets the most attention, of technological displacement and rapid change. And the other is slow productivity growth. In the long run, what matters for our living standards is how much we could produce with our limited resources. And disruption brings productivity growth. In recent years, productivity growth in the US and around the world has slowed considerably, which is one of the reasons why we're seeing slower wage growth. So I actually have a greater concern about productivity growth being too low going forward rather than too rapid displacement. The US economy has always been dynamic. I did the following exercise. I said, since 2000, what percent of our jobs are in new occupations? And I define new occupations as ones that the Bureau of Labor Statistics recognized for the first time after 2000. These new occupations included desktop publishing, wind turbine operators, numerical equipment operators, aerobics instructors, web developers. Now, some of these positions existed before 2000, but the BLS didn't think them important enough or large enough to include yet. 44% of job growth since 2000 have been in occupations that the BLS did not even recognize as of 2000. That's actually slower pace of change in the preceding 40 years. So the U.S. is always going through a dynamic cycle where the nature of jobs is changing. And it's also the case that the new jobs tend to pay more. Those 44% of the job growth that I mentioned, they pay wages on average that are 80% higher. Now, there are many forecasts about how artificial intelligence and robotics and automation more generally are going to affect jobs going forward. The OECD has an estimate that about 25% of jobs that currently exist in the U.S. will be in jeopardy because of automation over the next 20 years. That's actually not a particularly terrifying number if you look at the transitions in the workforce that we've had over recent decades or since the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. And the U.S. is also on the relatively low end in terms of jobs that are at risk by automation compared to the rest of the world, according to the OECD. My concern is the types of jobs that are at risk. The types of jobs that are at risk tend to be less skilled jobs, tend to be jobs in food preparation or driving. Driving is a very good example. 1 in every 9 jobs in the U.S. involves a significant component of driving. And it's obvious how those jobs are at risk. You had the head of Waymo here yesterday. Now, I think there are many benefits to be had by going to autonomous vehicles for safety, for productivity, for expanding access for communities. If people live more remotely with autonomous vehicles, they'll be able to commute to work at longer distances, and I think that will help connect more rural areas to cities and areas of greater economic activity. It'll help disabled people to have more mobility. And of course, people who have jobs driving right now are going to face risks. The best estimates are that this transition will take place gradually enough, and I think this is what John Krafchick said yesterday as well, that this transition will be manageable. If we compare other major changes in technology like ATMs, we still have jobs for bank tellers. So I think what's important is that we start to prepare for the transition that's taking place. Now, one aspect of the changing technology that I think is not widely appreciated is that the new technology is changing the nature of the relationship between workers and employers. And we see this in lots of ways. Outsourcing. We now have a supply chain for labor as well as a supply chain for other inputs in the economy. Part of the reason why outsourcing has increased, and Larry Katz, who's on the next panel, and I have done work together on this, is because work is more routinized, more standardized. Everyone is using Microsoft Office. They can easily ship their products and their output around to different employers. Another change in the nature of work because of the technology is more workers are finding jobs over the internet, digital platform jobs. The obvious ones are Uber and Lyft, but they're growing in other fields as well. And there are around 1 million workers who are currently working on ride-sharing platforms like Uber and Lyft. I think we need to update our social contract in a way that makes sense in this new environment. For example, Uber and Lyft can make contributions to Social Security the way other employers make contributions to Social Security. I think we should extend social protections to workers in the emerging platform economy, but only extend the ones that make sense so that we can maintain the benefits of the flexibility for these new types of jobs. And I also think it's important that we rebalance our labor laws so that workers get a fair shake in the economy. And one example I wanted to highlight has to do with no poaching agreements. Now, it's illegal for companies to have an agreement that they won't hire workers away from each other. But there's a gray area when it comes to franchise chains. So McDonald's, for over 30 years, has had a clause which prohibited its franchisees from hiring workers away from other McDonald's franchisees. This falls in a gray area. Are they separate companies or are they not separate companies? Well, just last week, the Attorney General in the state of Washington, Bob Ferguson, reached an agreement with 7 of the largest fast food franchise companies, including McDonald's, Jimmy John's, Auntie Anne's, Cinnabon, to drop those restrictions. Because those restrictions were preventing worker mobility. They were a restraint on competition, and I think everyone should agree that competition should be fair in the labor market. So I think the future of work is already here. I think we need to have a comprehensive approach to ensure that all segments of society benefit from the innovations that are happening right now and that are going to continue to happen. And I applaud your engagement in all of these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Kruger. I want to ask a question first. It's interesting listening to you. I heard a resonance of some other things I've heard from other business leaders. The president of Microsoft was giving an address a few months ago, and Microsoft, of course, is really leading the advance of artificial intelligence. Governor Burgum is very familiar with that. And the President Brad Smith basically kind of used your language that because of the pace that he believes will be enormously beneficial to humans, but because of the pace of change, it will require what he called a new social contract. And it's interesting to hear a president of a major tech company echo what an academician is saying. I was at another international conference, and a CEO of a major corporation, where he was listening to his fellow tech CEOs, and they were talking about the incredible benefits that artificial intelligence is going to bring in productivity and GDP growth. And he said, you know, I agree with you. This is going to do tremendous things for GDP. We're going to have great new products, great new services. But he said, but all you guys are going to be in your autonomous vehicles that are really nice, and you'll be listening to your favorite music, but you won't be so happy when there's a mob around you wanting to set your car on fire because they can't earn a living, because wages are so depressed and income inequality has become so pernicious. So I guess my question is we already have an income inequality thing that's causing great anxiety in our society. Intrinsically, does artificial intelligence make that more of a concern, less of a concern, the same? How should we think of it?
I think it intensifies the concern. I think a major driver of the rise in inequality we've had is related to the technological change, to computer and information technology. Jobs that can be routinized have been, to a large extent, automated. So I think that continues to be a concern. I think the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to approaching it is through education. I think there's widespread consensus that we could do much more in terms of education. By the way, in listening to the last session, I completely agree we should have more music education in schools and history education. I would add financial literacy and statistical education. Our school year is too short. And this is, something which state policy can directly affect. Our school year used to be the longest in the world, and then we stopped raising the length of the school year, and now we're behind almost every other major economy. So one approach, obviously, is through education, and I think that makes a lot of sense because it increases the size of the pie. But I think we can also give a lot of thought to ways in which we could help support workers so that they have more bargaining power, because they've lost a tremendous amount of bargaining power. Labor unions represent under 9% of the private workforce now. And I think because of that, we don't really have an even playing field. And what can we do in terms of public policy to help have a more even playing field? That's why I pointed out the issue with the no poaching agreements. And I think, workers tend to get raises to a large extent because they change jobs, because they seek better opportunities. And if we have policies in place and corporate policies in place that are restraining mobility, that's not good for the economy overall, and it's certainly not good for workers. So I think our problems are harder because of the rise in inequality. it's much more difficult for children from disadvantaged families to get the types of educational services that my children have and that other advantaged families have. So I think that makes it a much more difficult problem, but I still think it's a solvable problem.
Governor Dugard.
Yes, thank you. Earlier you talked about the stagnation in productivity growth, or the relatively slow productivity growth. And it just seems counterintuitive that as we automate more things, that productivity isn't also improving. And do you have any explanation for that, or any ideas about why that simultaneously can
Yes,
occur?
it's a great question. And we certainly have the perception that life is changing very, very rapidly. But it was changing very rapidly in the 60s and 70s also. And in terms of productivity gains, there's an argument that some of the great gains are really behind us. In healthcare, antibiotics. Think about how many lives have been saved by antibiotics. And what we're doing now is of tremendous value, but compared to what we did in the past and the improvements, it's affecting fewer lives. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is we're just missing a lot of the productivity gains. I don't believe that's the case, but a lot of the improvements, with cell phones go unmeasured. But I think that was true historically as well, and I think the mismeasurement probably has not gotten worse. If you try to trace the slowdown in productivity growth, about half of it is due to slower investment. And some of that I think is going to recover. Some of that is a direct result of the financial crisis, and companies weren't investing in the aftermath of the financial crisis. I think we're going to get past that eventually. That's maybe half of the slowdown in productivity growth. The other half is what we call total factor productivity, which is the part that economists can't explain, so we give it the name total factor productivity. And a little bit of that is slowdown in education, but not that much. So I think also we need to invest more in research and development. One area I would recommend for the states to invest more in research and development to raise productivity growth is in the area of education. The education sector is always the last to be disrupted. And I think there's tremendous potential from AI, from adaptive learning systems, to complement what's going on in the classroom. And not to replace teachers, but to support teachers. And this is an area where I think the federal government should do much more because it would benefit all of the states. But the states can also experiment with different ways of using the online education that's available with higher education right now. One of the things I had proposed when I worked for President Obama was that we support the land-grant colleges and say, we're going to give you funds to try different models for education. Maybe the students stay at home their freshman year and take core courses online, they pass those exams, then they come for 3 years. Or while they're in college, they're taking one online course and they're going to 3 or 4 courses each semester where they have contact with faculty. There are different ways of trying to do this, but there's, I think, tremendous potential to use the technology to improve our human capital and to address the problems that we face in the labor market.
Professor Kruger, thank you for being here. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned about workforce participation and had a comparison to us, I think, near the bottom, near Italy. Would you want to just expand a little bit on workforce participation, some of the challenges, and maybe some of the solutions you see?
Yes. So the problem, there are many cross currents in the labor force participation rate. What drove participation in the U.S. in the post-war period was more and more women joining the labor force. Women joined the labor force during World War II out of necessity, and then they continued to join. And that boosted our economic growth. I think it was very good for our society. That came to an end around 2000. Labor force participation of women has edged down since 2000. That's not the case in Canada. In Canada, it continues to rise. And the U.S. used to have one of the highest labor force participation rates in the world for women, and now we're in the middle of the OECD. I think the issues for women are different than the issues for men. For women, I think the issues have to do with flexibility at work, raising families and working at the same time. The U.S. is the only advanced country that doesn't have mandatory maternity leave, paid maternity leave. And I think enlightened companies are going to find that these types of policies are very much in their interest, given our demographics, given the aging workforce and the slower growth in labor force participation. For men, the issues I think are different. A very important issue is the rise in inequality and the decline in opportunities for less educated men. Labor force participation for men has been declining for decades. It fell more quickly after the 1980s, in part because of the decline in opportunities for lower paid men. I would say that's probably the top reason, but you also have a number of men who have criminal justice records, and that makes it difficult for them to get back into the labor force. And then over the last 15, 20 years, this problem has intersected with the opioid crisis. In my work, I found that almost half of the prime age men who are out of the labor force take pain medication on any given day. And it's not clear whether they had an injury that caused them to take pain medication, or when they were out of the labor force, they were depressed and they started to take pain medication. In many cases, this is opioid medication. It makes it harder for them to get back into the labor force. So I think that there are many disparate causes of the decline in labor force participation, and it's very much in our interest to do what we can to raise labor force participation in the U.S. because we're going to be facing a shortage. The last point, of course, is the older workforce. Older workers have lower labor force participation, and that's going to be a drag on labor force participation for the next 2 decades. That's going to subtract 0.2, 0.3 of a percentage point from the participation rate a year going forward. So we are very much swimming upstream when it comes to labor force participation.
Thank you. We're going to have to wrap this up. I want to thank Mr. Davey, and I would commend this report to our governors and your staffs. There really is some good info in here, and it's specific to our region, so I think it'd be helpful. Dr. Kruger, thank you. I really appreciate what you've had to say today. I know that we all share in a bipartisan belief that we look forward to the success of artificial intelligence because we hope it will eliminate natural ignorance, and that would make our jobs all much easier. And we're looking forward to that bright day. We know the country's always done well in times of innovation and technological change. We're confident that's going to happen, but we have to put our heads together and figure out some solutions for our people. So thanks very much to everybody, and have a round of applause for our 2 panelists here. Thanks a lot. We're at ease.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 5-minute break and then begin our final session. Thank you.